In this chapter, we're talking about the American Revolution. So we talked last time about some things leading up to the revolution, and we'll talk a little more this time about how colonists transition from a very British mentality to the desire that starts for independence, and it's a reluctant desire, and how it develops from there into what we know today. So let's get started. All right, so here's where we're starting. All the colonists are very British at this particular point. They still like all the things that everyone back home loves. They have the same fashion trends. They have the same things that are cool at home, are cool in the colonies. The traditions are all the same. So the colonists are still very British at this particular point. They had no intention on being independent. And I think that that's something we lose track of when we start studying American history at a very young age, like in elementary school, when you first start talking about US history. We get the idea that people were unhappy back home. They wanted to go to a new place, to start a new country with their own rules. And that just really isn't exactly how it came to be. So at this particular point, there's no intention by these British colonists on becoming independent or an independent nation. The colonists are being punished for destroying the tea in Boston Harbor, which we talked about in the last chapter. It's also important to remember that not all the colonists supported that. I mean, not everyone was 100% on board with that. Not everyone knew it was going to happen, for one thing. But remember, that was a tactic, an intimidation tactic by the Sons of Liberty. So this is something that all Americans are being punished for, something that one small group of people did. And those acts that cause the punishment are what the colonists referred to as the coercive or intolerable acts. It's not like Parliament said, let us pass now the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. That's just the name that the colonists gave it. So the intolerable acts have been passed, and now the colonies are having those enforced upon them. And that leads to something called disaffection. It's when you no longer love your government, your home government. So affection is love, disaffection is lack of love. So it's pretty easy to remember what disaffection is. Because of those intolerable acts, the colonists in America have fallen out of love with their British government, which is led under the rule of King George at this particular point. So the colonists kind of start trying to figure out what they're going to do, what kind of response they should have to this. They develop the Suffolk Resolves, and the First Continental Congress meets to address possible responses to the intolerable acts. The leaders of Suffolk County, Massachusetts, passed the Suffolk Resolves, which basically call for a boycott of British goods until the intolerable acts are repealed. Then something else happens along the way, which is just really kind of strange. So the Virginia legislature meets in 1774 and declares that they want to support Boston by observing a day of fasting and prayer. Now, this is not an official legislative rule of any kind. It's not legislation passed. It's just saying, we feel bad for the people of Boston. Let's fast and pray for them. The colony governor gets wind of it and cancels the legislature of that colony. So that is seen as a huge imposition on, one, religion. I mean, it's an opportunity to pray for people in another colony. And two, it's a direct imposition on the government that they developed to oversee the colony. So the members of the Virginia legislative body, despite the fact that it's been dissolved, continue meeting in secrecy and vow to support other colonies to help preserve the common rights and liberty of British America. So now we're having this little term that's developed. So they were colonies or colonists from Great Britain. Now they're calling this territory that they're in British America. So kind of separating a little bit, saying that they're British, but this is a separate place, which is an important aspect for them to realize, because until this point, they've kind of looked at it as an extension of their government. And now they're kind of starting to separate a little from it. Now, British is still in there, British is still part of the title, but the idea of America, so that's starting to happen here with this Virginia conflict. In terms of the First Continental Congress, the First Continental Congress met. We had 13 colonies, only 12 of them sent representatives to meet for the First Continental Congress. Georgia didn't send anyone. They met in Philadelphia for a few days from September 5th to October 25th, so just a little over a month. And it was basically just to toss around some ideas as far as what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? We have this conflict. We have the British government shutting down legislatures in Virginia. We have them being harsh for penalties for this whole Boston Tea Party thing that a few people did. Now we're all paying for it. So they start tossing around ideas. What are we going to do? At the First Continental Congress, some people suggested that there would be an American parliament created on American soil with a president that would be similar to the British monarch. Now, they didn't want to pick their own king because, according to the beliefs and the system of the way the monarchy worked, the king would have been a long succession of divine rights. So you don't just pick a king. I mean, a king is chosen. So chosen for you by God. So you're not just going to pick a king. So they're like, maybe we could pick someone to lead us, like a president. We could do something like that. Also, some ideas came about to separate from the crown altogether, which was a really radical idea, because again, none of these people expected to separate from their government when they became colonists. So the results of the First Continental Congress is that they decided as a group collectively to support the Suffolk Resolve, which basically said, let's boycott all British goods. They decided to start that starting December 1st, 1774. And that boycott would only end if Great Britain rescinded those intolerable acts. So they're giving a way out. They're saying, we will stop boycotting if you will take away those rules against us, the intolerable acts. They also considered organization options. They decided to publish a list of rights and grievances and to petition King George to hear their grievances. So we have some preparation beginning here because this is going to create turmoil. We have British and rebels who are preparing for conflict. Now, we have British at home in Great Britain, but we also have British on American soil. Some of those are colonial officials appointed by the British government back home to be here. Some of those are loyalist people who were colonists, but who still very much supported the king and the way things were being done. So it's still not 100%, as far as all of the colonists are not calling for independence. So we still have British people, both in Great Britain and on American colony soil at this particular point. Boston becomes the military headquarters for the British, and British soldiers from Boston go into nearby towns and raid those towns for guns and gunpowder. So that's one of the preparations that the British Army is making, and it very much alarms the colonists who have been fearing that it might come to something like this. They develop a group of people called Minutemen. These are veterans of the French and Indian War who literally are ready in a minute's notice to go fight. So those are Minutemen who were formed from the colonists to fight against the British should it come to that. Great Britain's General Gage raids Concord for munitions. There's a midnight ride that helps signal the Minutemen, and the skirmish that first erupted was at Lexington and then Concord. There were a number of British soldiers who died. 73 British soldiers died, 49 patriots. So we're calling the patriots the colonists. So 73 British soldiers died, 49 colonists died, and the British retreat back to Boston. So this British retreat gives the American colonists some hope and some promise for something, for a potential win. So there still hasn't, and until this point, until there was actual bloodshed, there was still some hope that war would be averted, that this wouldn't have to happen. But as soon as the American colonists killed British soldiers, they knew that there's no going back at that point. And so then they had to be all in for this war. So I think it's interesting that the Boston Tea Party happened. And then we have these things happening too, you know, these skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. It brings to mind insurrection, which is a word we've heard a lot in recent years since the insurrection at the Capitol, something you hear about a lot. The January 6th insurrection, you hear it called a bunch of different things. When people stormed the Capitol in response to a voter count that was going to happen that day. So I just want to call attention to two terms that are important to American history: insurrection and insurgents. Insurrection is an organized opposition to authority. It's a mutiny. And insurgents is an uprising or a rebellion and insurrection. So both of these words basically are interchangeable. So I think it's interesting when we talk about things today, when we refer to the insurrection at the Capitol has a very negative connotation. But when we talk about the insurgents related to like the Boston Tea Party, that has a very positive connotation, that is something that people are proud of for independence. So I think it's funny to see how these words kind of flip-flop over time. And there are other words throughout history too that make a shift and change. So we'll continue looking at those as we continue following through U.S. history this semester.